Hello. Welcome to my channel Touching Stories. You're about to hear an amazing story about love and unexpected decisions. Enjoy watching. The sun rose over the cemetery of Hirsch on a small house. The rays of the sun hit the old shabby window and gently touched his cheek. A man in his 40s took a deep breath, moved his lips, and opened his faded blue eyes. He was not yet old, but his huge gray beard made him a real old man. His name was Simon Starkov, and he didn't mind. However, it seemed to him that this was someone else's name. Almost 3 years have passed since Simon started a new life, woke up with a broken head, all covered in blood, in the lair of local homeless people. He did not remember how someone bent over him and said, "I told you that he is still alive, but you almost buried him. Get out, if it's God's will." It was one of the kindest vagabonds, Andrew Wonson. He was a believer. He did not get into fights. He tried to judge everyone. Others came to him as to an Oriental sage so that Andrew would judge the dispute, help settle this or that conflict. In their town, the homeless founded an entire community. There were 7 of them. There were others, but they did not live with the rest, but only occasionally came to talk, ask for help, or return the favor. Card games, drinking, fighting. This is what they had as their main activity. All of them were men over 50. Each had their own tragic story behind them. Simon listened to them all while they nursed him, and I realized one thing. Each of them even now had the opportunity to live differently, but did not want to for one reason or another. Someone was on the street out of desperation. Others out of principle, out of pride to spite someone. It seemed to Simon that he'd been a bum for a long time. He was found wearing expensive but very dirty and smelly clothes. Everyone decided that Simon found it in the trash or stole it somewhere, for which in fact he received that blow to the head, which is on the past memory. He remembered the first days poorly. He vomited all the time, embarrassed. He felt hot sweat and fear. Over time, the condition improved, but the fear did not leave him. He continued to fear his own shadow. Andrew Wonson thought it was past, a perfectly normal occurrence for survivors of an attack. Simon was homeless, begging for alms. I worked part-time. One day, while studying the city, he wandered to its very outskirts and saw that very place, a hill from which the whole city was in full view. The locals didn't really like these places. The slope was very steep. Do not drive by car. The walk is long and difficult. Painfully winding path led up to the hill. When I got there, I gasped for the first time. Every single building of that small town and factories in the private sector with sides, with expensive houses, and the ghetto where only old people lived. Everything was in full view. I did not see everything, and the new cemetery, which was often talked about in the community. He badly wanted to go there. It was rumored that someone was constantly buried there, and the rich often look for someone who, for a small fee, takes care of the grave of their loved one. Of course, most of the orders went to the cemetery workers, the security guard. But one of the local homeless people was entrusted with looking after the grave of some influential professor in the past, and they gave him such a sum that he got dressed, settled down, and cut his hair. The rich did not spare money when it came to those who were dear to them. Others also said they wanted to go there. Maybe they'll get something. Each of them was looking for easy money. All of them were lazy people ready to live on the street, if only not to work. Simon decided to go there to the cemetery and ask for an assistant. He was not afraid of work. Yes, only few people wanted to mess with a man like him. No registration, no passport. No memory. He saw where the cemetery was and walked there for several hours. Noticing a brand new brick building in front of him, Simon timidly knocked on the window. From there, a very plump man of about 30 looked out. "What do you, father?" he asked kindly. "I'm looking for work. Maybe you need some help. I am ready to dig a grave for anything, to look after. And you will be helped, and I'm fine." The fat man thought, "You probably live nearby." "I don't live anywhere." "No, at my house. I woke up in an instant with a broken head. The homeless were invited. The police went. They just didn't accept my application. Driven away, photographed and promised to look in the database. I came to them later and they answered me that there were no missing people like me. Yes, then, however, I was sharply up to my ears after an injury with a bruise all over my face. Hey! The fat man frowned. There are no jobs here. Here we have a strict boss. They advertised a private cemetery. They invested a lot of money here. There are paths and statues. Everything is like in the movies. It's not an option for you to find a job here, but you can go to the old cemetery. They still bury those who do not have money to buy a place. Here it is a little higher and on the other side of the hills. Enter there, and the guardhouse is empty there. Can you live in it? He burns with firewood. The oven is working, unless they pulled her out, of course. Simon thanked for the advice and wandered off towards the old cemetery. Again, I had to climb up to the hill from which he came down here. I wanted to eat and drink. Legs are tangled. But Simon would have loved the prospect of living elsewhere. He couldn't stand living in a den with the homeless. He often got into fights. He tried to separate the robbers of the peasants. Here he flew. When he reached the hill, he looked a little to the left and found that where the sun was setting, he could see a tiny hut. Behind it, the cemetery itself was visible. The place there was wonderful silence, beauty, hills, sunsets, and sunrises. When I came closer, I saw that the cemetery was clean, overgrown with grass. Only the tops of the crosses were visible. He stepped closer and froze. An old woman made her way towards him through the tall grass. Thick grass, ears of corn. She boldly walked apart the wilds with her hands. She gave the impression that she was one of those who had been buried here not so long ago, or so I thought. He began to read the prayer. Andrew taught him. And you, son, who will you be? I also came to visit. Yes, everything is abandoned here. Nobody even mows the grass. Eh, said the grandmother, closing the cemetery behind her through the high gate. Simon realized that there was nothing to be afraid of. This is just a local came, apparently, to visit a deceased relative. He sighed. I would like to look after the cemetery. So I'm telling you, they abandoned the cemetery. Someone will pay you. I don't have to pay. If only there was a roof over your head. I don't need any more. Together they entered an old abandoned house near the cemetery. It was dirty inside. On trample down the house was quite small. In the corner by the sink, behind a curtain, is a toilet. Oh, yes, all the conveniences. Even I don't have one. Granny Karen laughed timidly and smiled. Can I stay here? Simon asked. Certainly. Here last summer, teenagers had booze parties, and my house is close by. Yes, and I come here often, almost every day. So I drove them cursed. What is the light on? In the end, they left, and the house has been empty ever since. Mastered. And I'll bring you pies tomorrow. After a month of living here, Simon found a part-time job. The locals started coming anyway. He was paid to look after the graves. They paid meagerly, but he did not refuse anyone. The grandmother he met at the cemetery really came every day. Her name was Mrs. Karen Torres. Especially for her, Simon cleared a path in the center of the cemetery. She told him her story. Mrs. Torres was a distinguished history teacher. Retired, she had a husband and had a daughter. She lived just like everyone else, but in 1 year, everything changed. It's like someone jinxed it. The husband caught pneumonia, went to the hospital and died in a few hours. It happened so fast that she was in shock. Karen called her daughter and told the news. She had just unlearned her driving license, and her boyfriend gave her a car. She recently found out that she is pregnant. There was supposed to be a wedding. So much good news. The parents were so happy. Mrs. Torres' husband was waiting for the birth of a grandson. Most of all, he managed to get along with his daughter's fiancé. And then suddenly such grief. Lauren, Mrs. Torres' daughter, got behind the wheel and drove off. Her fiancé was with her in the passenger seat. Mrs. Karen called and asked to be careful driving, but rather put the groom behind the wheel. Lauren was shocked too, and it was dangerous to drive the car in such a state. However, the girl did not listen. On the road, the car skidded, and she flew into the oncoming lane, where she was hit by a wagon with rubble. All died on the spot. So in one day, Mrs. Torres lost her husband, with whom she had been married for 32 years, and her daughter and a failed son-in-law and an unborn grandson. She saved money for a long time, wanted to make a chick gift, daughters for the wedding, but it turned out differently. Bought 3 coffins and kept them all here. In this very cemetery. It was 11 years ago. But to this day, Mrs. Torres comes to the burial place of her relatives almost every day. Lauren's fiancé, Julio, was an orphan, and there would have been no one to bury him if Mrs. Torres had refused. But she accepted this responsibility and put her daughter together with her lover. Simon felt sorry for his grandmother. She often came to him just to talk, because she had no one else to talk to. In his youth, her husband met with another. She waited for him from the army. There was supposed to be a wedding, but he met Karen, who had just moved to the village. She was very young. She came to practice at the school, or saw her and realized that she was gone. It was love at first sight. Mrs. Torres said that the other girl who faithfully waited for him was the daughter of a gypsy. She blamed everything on their family, because when Tobias broke up with her and sent matchmakers to Karen, the gypsy came to the threshold of her house and fell asleep with curses. She screamed that Tobias was obliged to marry her Rosita, that her daughter even tried to lay hands on herself. She loved him so much, but he refused. Lawless heart. The gypsy was driven away, and she never showed up on their doorstep again. But the marriage was difficult. Tobias's parents and Karen left in turn. One after another, every year a new cross on the churchyard. They lived for 10 years childless, and they also blamed the gypsy with her curses. Rosita, by the way, soon died at a very young age. The gypsies did not consider it necessary to call doctors. They treated with their own methods. And the girl had acute appendicitis. By the time the mother called the doctor, it was already too late. The girl was dying on the way to the hospital. Her parents were heartbroken. Rosita was said to have died with Tobias's name on her lips. She loved him so much. After that, their large family moved. They were not nomadic, rented a house, kept cattle. For some reason, they could not stay in these places anymore. Perhaps everything here reminded them of the loss. Rosita was the eldest of 5 sisters in a gypsy family. In addition, their parents, aunts, and uncles also lived with them. Mrs. Torres thought the gypsy woman's curse had taken its toll. Even after many years, she prayed for her soul all her life. Rosita put a candle in the church for the repose of her soul. And when she found out about the pregnancy, she thought that Rosita had finally forgiven her. Lauren was born, and they began to live normal lives. It seemed that everything was behind us a long time ago. But in an instant, only Karen remained from a large and friendly family. Mrs. Torres often called Simon to her place. She was lonely. She would need help with the housework. Besides, she wanted to take care of someone. Maintaining old age is not a joy. Not much will happen. But Simon refused. He came to her house several times, either to fix the faucet in the column or to patch up the door for his help. He did not ask for anything, but Mrs. Karen Torres always gave him a bag of food with her. Yes, a couple of dollars. Simon did not refuse. He took it because he needed it. But he was still embarrassed. He considered it even more shameful to live in a strange house on the neck of an old grandmother. That's why he rejected her every time. He did not remember what his upbringing was. but he clearly did not allow him to be a freeloader. Simon spent the winter at the old cemetery. He heated with firewood, cleared the snow. Local residents, recognizing him, began to thank him, brought him unnecessary things, shoes, something from food. So he survived the winter. Spring came, beginning of April. The winds blew incessantly. It was frozen, the ice came down from the hills, and their peaks are already visible there. You could see young green grass, extraterrestrial life. The snow was loose, but there was a lot of it. Simon left the house to clear the path. Mrs. Torres was supposed to come today. However, as always, he was waiting to feed her. One grandmother brought some gingerbread to the cemetery and did not take sweets right away. But when people left, he took everything, since he loved sweets very much. The sound of an engine was heard in the distance. Simon did not see a funeral cortege of only 2 cars approaching him. The one that carried the coffin is another very powerful black foreign car. Both cars stopped. From there, people came out. All of them were in black clothes. A 16-year-old teenager got out of the accompanying car. He choked into sobs. Simon was approached by men and asked if he could help them dig the grave. There were not enough people. Ever not enough people. Everyone caught this newfangled virus and went to bed. I was very surprised that the funeral crew was clearly one of the most budget options in any solid one. Be sure to allocate a tractor for these cases. In extreme cases, people would come and do everything in half an hour with shovels. And here are 2 reaching. Both are in their 50s. It looked like they had been picked up from the street and asked for help. The coffin was very expensive, which again went against the grain of the funeral car. It was a well-worn, beat-up Ford, without logos and other paraphernalia. Simon did everything he was asked to do. Helped dig the grave, helped lift the coffin. When the boy opened it, all the sobs went in. Apparently his father was with him. The one that brought him in a black car, he did not cry. He did not cry. It seemed to him it didn't matter. He wanted to leave quickly. Simon looked into the coffin. There was a woman, but for some reason her face was covered with a black cloth. He understood this was done so as not to shock the child. This is what happens when people get into an accident. The teenager wanted to show his face, but his father forbade him to do so. "You were told that you can't touch anything here," he barked irritably. And the guy paid back. When they began to close the lid of the coffin, the boy began to scream and sob. From his exclamation, it became clear that the woman was his mother. The father began to drag his son away from the coffin, and he clutched at him, not allowing him to cover with a lid. At that moment, the canvas flew off and everyone was doused with cold sweat. The woman in the coffin was alive. She looked at Simon and then looked away. They were terrified. Simon immediately averted his gaze, and the boy's father quickly replaced the black canvas in place, timidly looking at Simon. "You should take the boy away before he has a tantrum," Simon said. "I'll finish it myself here, finish it myself." "I don't mind," he said. The man was happy about this and began to take the guy away. He put his son in the car and dismissed the breathless men who brought the coffin in an old Ford. When everyone moved away, he began to cover the coffin with a lid. "Don't be afraid, I won't betray you. I realized that you are alive. I'll just pretend to nail up the coffin. Don't be afraid, I'll save you," he said. Then the boy's father approached him. "Thank you. His mother is dead. He is not in himself with grief. Here, take it. Thank you again for helping," the man said. With a smile, he handed Simon so much money that he was afraid to take it. There was an impressive amount. It was possible to buy groceries several months in advance. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'll do everything." "Don't worry," he replied. The man was about to leave when he suddenly stopped. "How are you going to put it down?" "Alone?" he asked. Belts lay on the ground along with the coffin. "I'm not alone. Now my shift will come," He ran to the store. "We will do everything in the best possible way." Simon lied. The man was glad that everything ended so quickly. He was in a hurry to leave. Simon put the lid on the coffin for believability and began to bang on the nail so that the man could hear it. He got into the car and left. Simon followed the car with his eyes. I waited for him to disappear over the horizon. How strange was it all? The old Ford was clearly not an undertaker. More like local drunks. The woman in the coffin is alive, but the man carefully hid it. He was visibly startled when the boy reached out to take off the canvas and take one last look at her. Simon removed the lid of the coffin and threw the canvas aside. The woman lay motionless. Her eyes were closed. Isn't that what it seemed? He was frightened. Suddenly the stranger opened her large brown eyes and looked at Simon with a belittling look. He sighed, looked around, made sure that no one saw him, and pulled her out of the coffin. The woman seemed to be paralyzed. Simon carried her into the cabin, laid her on the bed, and covered her with a blanket. "Twice, if you're thirsty. If not, once," he told her. The woman blinked twice. Simon tried to get her drunk, but she began to choke. Her body didn't seem to be listening. The cough was difficult. With grief in half, she drank water, took a few sips. "I have to bury the coffin. After all, I hid you, and you will be here for now." "Fine. You don't need anything else now." The woman blinked once, and everyone realized that she could leave her. He went out, grabbed the coffin, threw it into the grave, and began to bury it. At that moment, a car drove up to the cemetery again. Simon's soul went to his heels. Now this man will find a woman in his house and kill Simon. Who knows what a man who buries a living woman is capable of? "Where is your partner?" asked the man, looking into the grave. "Departed. Twisted it once. The canned food was expired. The coffin was just lowered, and he left me here alone. Well, nothing. You don't have to share money with him especially." Simon winked at the peasant, showing that he had his own advantage here. This was to allay his suspicions. "It's not just that he came back. Clear. Thank you again. Just thought you might need help. I took the guy to a cafe where the wake is held and arrived. But thanks again." The man left this time for good. Simon buried the empty coffin and put up the cross. He had a ready-made sign on him, from which he learned that his guest was Mrs. Alexandra Bridget Hopkins. She would have been 28 years old if she had not died yesterday. Simon returned to her. "Don't be afraid of me. I'm a bum. I lost my memory. I live here." He began to speak to her. "I don't know how to take care of the paralyzed, but it's definitely wrong to bury them." "Is this guy your husband?" Simon asked. The woman blinked twice. "The boy was crying for you." "He's your son, I take it." The woman blinked twice again. "Okay, don't worry. My friend is coming soon. She will tell me how to take care of you. You won't get lost." When Mrs. Torres arrived, she was shocked by what she had heard. Simon met her at the door and told her everything, and only then led her inside. I even thought that I was going crazy, that I imagined. Karen looked at the woman. "Are you paralyzed after the accident?" she asked. Alex blinked once. "No." "You've been stabbed with something," Mrs. Torres guessed, and looked at Alex with curiosity. She confirmed the guess. Tears spilled from her eyes. "The paralytic drug will wear off, honey. You just have to wait. But for your safety, it's better to bring you to me. As it gets dark, all of them will carry you. And I'll take care of you. He has no conditions for you here. Besides, he's a man, and with me, it will be easier for you, right?" Grandma smiled. Alex blinked twice. It didn't suddenly occur to Simon that she would need to. It's no joke that caring for the paralyzed is not only about feeding. He was embarrassed and thought that Mrs. Torres would actually do a better job of it. It turned out that Karen was well versed with medicines. She even named several drugs that could cause such an effect. When it got dark, Simon picked up the thin, dark-haired woman in his arms and carried her into the house to Mrs. Torres. She had everything she needed. Moreover, she gave Alex some kind of injection, said that this would help her recover more quickly. Simon went home. He came to them every day, helped Karen if Alex needed to be raised. She, as before, was silent and motionless, like a doll, by God. Simon said to himself, I am amazed how this can be done to a person. It took a long time before Alex began to recover. Simon came that day to Mrs. Therese and the hostess was smiling. Alex began to come to life. Her hands move. Her legs move. We even talked to her yesterday, and today she feels even better. Apparently, the drug is excreted from the body. Finally. And then I already thought that she would remain paralyzed. Simon entered the room and saw that Alexandra was sitting on the bed. Hello, how do you feel? He smiled. Alex smiled too. Thank you, she said quietly. Simon was at a loss, not knowing what to say. Just then Mrs. Torres came into the room. Can you already tell us how it happened that you were almost buried alive? Simon immediately thought that it was your husband who did it to you on purpose. Therefore, they have not yet begun to contact the official bodies. What connections does he have? Or were we wrong? Maybe he's worried. It came about by misunderstanding. Alex shook her head. She spoke slowly and quietly. No, you are not mistaken. My husband Mark is a terrible person. He is a doctor, and I am a well-known psychiatrist, PhD. I had money, and he decided to court me and take everything away. I didn't understand it from the very beginning. Fell in love with him like a girl. But I was already well over 30. The son from his first marriage is quite an adult. I gave birth to Matthew early, brought up alone. I wanted to believe that he was my destiny. But as a psychiatrist, I should have noticed the disturbing symptoms in him. This feeling closed my eyes, and I came to my senses when we were already married, began to notice his greed, stinginess. I saw that he never loved me. He only wanted my money. He wanted to take everything from me. And I also noticed in him traits inherent only in maniacs. But he chalked it up to his hard work. He's also a doctor. And doctors need to be cold, blooded, otherwise nothing. Mark began to show cruelty to me. During our quarrels, he could hit me, beat me up once. So I didn't go to work for 2 weeks. He began to ask me to give him access to the account. This account was everything that I have earned in my entire life. With this money, he could not deny himself anything for a long time. I didn't agree. But one day he got tired of building a boy in love out of himself. He came and beat me, and he beat me until I told him the account details. Then he threw me out of the window. I survived. When she opened her eyes, she saw him. I was not paralyzed, I escaped with only bruises. But he managed to give me some kind of injection, and I could not even open my eyes. It was terrible. I was conscious, but there was nothing I could do. My body didn't listen to me. Mark took me to his unit, faked my test results, and told my son Matthew that I had days left. He pricked me something every day. I passed out, woke up. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe 3 days, maybe a few weeks. Everything is in a fog. After another injection, I fell into a deep sleep. In my mind, I began to pray for death. I understood that, most likely I knew this drug, and after it I would no longer be full-fledged. I would not be able to recover. He poisoned me. I didn't think I would stay. But apparently the road to the cemetery brought me to myself, and I was able to open my eyes. Then Simon must have noticed that I was alive. I was horrified. I heard my son and I wanted to burst. I still can't imagine how you can survive this. I will never make it, and Matthew too, I think. He buried me. Simon, I beg you. Simon, I beg you. Bring my son. I'll give you the address. Steal it, please. Take it right now. I can't wait and he's tormented. But this is not the main thing. And that he is in danger. Matthew is also my heir. Mark will send him to the next world. It costs him nothing. Bring my son. I'll give you the address. Steal it, please. Take it right now. I can't wait and he's tormented. But this is not the main thing. And that he is in danger. Matthew is also my heir. Mark will send him to the next world. It costs him nothing. Bring my son. I'll give you the address. Steal it, please. Take it right now. I can't wait and he's tormented. But this is not the main thing. And that he's in danger. Matthew is also my heir. Mark will send him to the next world. It costs him nothing. Simon nodded decisively. I'm leaving right now. Where to find it? He asked. Matthew goes to school number 45. It's on the waterfront. That's where my house is. Do you remember he's my son? Tell him like it is. Just don't get caught by Mark. He will kill you and understand everything. Guess you didn't just end up there. Mrs. Torres smiled. Looks like it's time for you to shave. Come to my bathhouse, and I will get you my late husband's things. I didn't throw them away, as I knew they would come in handy. Half an hour later, everyone gasped. My God. I myself would never have recognized you in my life without your huge gray beard. You're half your age, Alex exclaimed. Simon was handsome. He had pleasant features, and his lips under his beard and mustache turned out to be sensitive. Like a movie character. Visually dropped at least 20 years. You don't have to worry. Mark won't recognize you even if he sees you, Alex concluded. Simon still has some money that Mark gave him for helping with the funeral. He left the house, finished off to a stop, and got on the bus, which took him to the city. It was past 12:00 when Simon was standing in front of the school. How do you know where Mark is, he thought. He was wearing a neat shirt and trousers. Things of the late husband of Mrs. Torres fit him perfectly. It was cold outside, but spring has already come into its own. The sun was losing. Simon wore a brand new leather jacket over his shirt. Her husband Karen bought before his death. Simon entered the schoolyard. Suddenly, a familiar black car drove up to the gate. It was definitely Mark. A whole class came out of the school doors. Among the other guys was Matthew. He was heading for the car. Simon wanted to run to him, but stopped him. At that moment, Mark got out of the car. What's going on here? Who are you? Mark asked Simon. The soul went to the heels. He was scared to death that now they would recognize him and everything would go to hell. But there was no time for fear. Good afternoon. I'm Matthew's new teacher. I would like to detain him in history, if you don't mind. Simon smiled and extended his hand to Mark. Victor Clinton. He gave out the first combination of first and last name that came to mind. Matthew frowned and looked at Simon in surprise. Simon, on the other hand, was as confident as he could be. Mark shook his hand. Okay, but you have to get on your own. I've got things to do, he said indifferently. Okay, I'll get there, Matthew replied. As the black car pulled away, Matthew looked at Simon in surprise. Just don't be scared. I'm about to tell you something shocking. Your mom is alive. They wanted to kill her. Mark was stabbed with something. And when I was about to bury her, I noticed. She is alive and asked me to pick you up. Matthew looked at the stranger. Were you the watchman at the cemetery, he guessed. I had to shave off my beard to get close to you. I'm surprised your father didn't notice. I was so afraid that he would understand who I am. He does not notice anyone but himself. What are you talking about? And he's not my father. And I believe you. But even if you are a maniac, then going with you will still be better than living with Mark. My name is Simon. Or rather, I don't remember my name, but others do. You call me that too, okay? We still make it to the bus. Matthew nodded and obediently followed the stranger. All the way, the guy asked only one question. Mom, is she really alive? Yes, she's alive. She told me where to find you. She said she was a psychiatrist. and Mark decided to get rid of her for money. And you're in great danger too, Matthew. Before leaving, Matthew put his cell phone on another bus to throw Mark off the trail. He tracked his stepson through the application. They drove for less than an hour, then walked for a long time. When they reached the porch, Matthew did not see his mother's shoes. "You didn't deceive me? Is she there?" he asked. "She is there. Go yourself, you will see everything." Matthew entered the house and, seeing his mother, wept and rushed to hug her. She too was able to raise her arms to hug her son. Simon and Mrs. Torres burst into tears. They left their son and mother alone. "Now they both will live with you?" Simon asked. "Yes, the house is big, you see. It was built to last. Let them live. I would be glad if they stayed here with me. I'm lonely, Simon. You don't want to come to me. What else is an old woman to do?" Simon smiled. "It's not right to sit on your neck. I myself must. You are a good person. You saved the family. You saved, and I only helped." Matthew came out of his mother completely different. He smiled. "Mom asked you to call," he said to Mrs. Torres. Simon poured Matthew tea. "I'm so glad you're doing well," he said with perfect sincerity. "Everything will be fine when Mark is put in jail." "I would kill him with my own hands if I could," the guy said. He had his mother's eyes, blonde hair, curls through the hole on the top of his head. "We'll do our best. Don't get excited. Your mom is a very smart woman, PhD. Let's think of something together. As long as you live here, you don't mind." "I don't care as long as I'm with my mother," Matthew replied. Simon made sure they were all right. I said goodbye and went out the gate. The air was so intoxicating that I wanted to sing and dance. Or is it because he did one very good deed today? Simon didn't want to sleep. He went to the hill where he liked to sit and look at the stars and the lights of the city. Everything was visible from there. The road was short but very difficult. "I'm different today," Simon whispered as he reached the top. He habitually sank down on the snag, which served him as a bench, and touched his face with his hand. It was unusually smooth. Wow. He shaved and became completely different. When Simon saw himself in the mirror, he kind of remembered something from his past life. It was the first such light. Some fragments floated before my eyes. He seemed to see himself next to a beautiful woman. She was a brunette. Her eyes shone with happiness, and she hugged him. She had red lips, and this lipstick really suited her. It seemed to him that that girl was not his wife or girlfriend, but rather just a friend or relative, according to his feelings. He also remembered that he wore trousers with suspenders and always wore a fresh white shirt. He seemed to see his reflection in the mirror and that girl. She was nearby, and something said to him in the nose was the smell of her perfume. He was sweet, woody. It was so clear, but only for a second. Then everything dissolved. It was getting chilly. Without a beard, he felt the spring wind with his skin. Matthew and Alex lived with Mrs. Torres. Spring has come into its own. Simon learned that Mark put his stepson on the wanted list, but everything was unsuccessful. He even called in to him and knocked on the window. Everyone was terribly scared then. If Mark hadn't remembered him during the funeral, he would have recognized him now. He also introduced himself as Matthew's teacher when he came for the boy. Simon was standing outside the door when Mark dutifully flung it open and stepped inside. "Is there anyone alive?" he called. Simon was still standing very close on the other side of the front door. He literally hung in the balance, but Mark did not look for him. "I thought there was no one." Alex went to the grave, stood there for a couple of minutes and left. "Everything is not." Only then did I see that Mark had placed 2 red roses on the mound. Apparently, the feeling of guilt is not alien to him. In the evening, he told everyone about his visit. Alex has already begun to slowly walk. Matthew helped her with everything, as did Mrs. Torres. "So he was on my grave," Alex chuckled. "Was. He loved you, probably because he brought you flowers," Simon said. Since then, he began to shave regularly. He liked to feel not a gray-haired bum, but a young man. I loved someone else. For a long time, I could not forget my father. Matthew hooked up with Mark because it was necessary. I thought he would be a good father to him. What happened to Matthew's father? Simon inquired. Mrs. Torres would have been embarrassed to ask Alex about this, but it was clear that the hostess listened with interest. I loved him for a long time. We had an affair. There was a wedding. Everything was. But the characters are too different. We are simply incompatible. We are bad together. Matthew's father went north to work, and so he stayed there. I know that he has a wife and 2 children. I forgot him and honestly tried to love Mark. He really captivated me. He was the first person I could fall in love with. This is probably why I did not see his real appearance, although I should have been supposed to understand people by profession. But I was all in emotions and could not see anything beyond my nose. What do you think to do with Mark? Simon asked. I'll just come to the reading of the will. This should take place a month after my funeral, just a week later. We'll go to the police station first with Matthew, and then we'll show up at the will. My lawyer is the most pedantic creature on earth. I know exactly where and when it will happen. Matthew went to help Mrs. Torres in the yard. She asked him to, and Alex and Simon were left alone. Do you have anyone else you would like to tell that you are alive? Simon asked. Alex looked up at him with unusually large and beautiful eyes. Of course I have. I don't have any close relatives. But there are girlfriends, there is a cousin, a sister. There are aunts and uncles. We were not too attached to each other, but they should not have survived my death. Sometimes I feel like I'm really dead. They are all sure of it. Simon took her hand in support, and a spark immediately ran. Their eyes met. Both were embarrassed. But Alex did not pull his hand away and only circled the hand, not with his thin fingers. You are very strong once you have experienced this. And you. Mrs. Torres told me that you don't remember anything. You know, I'm a psychiatrist, and my thesis was in hypnosis. I could try to help you remember. If you want. Simon raised his eyebrows. Hypnosis. Can you do it? Can. We'll try if you're not afraid, but when will you be ready? It would be creepy to let a stranger into your head. But what is he risking? Simon didn't think too long. We'll try when you're ready and when you have enough strength. I'm ready right now. Just need to warn Karen and Matthew. We will not be interfered with. Tell. Mrs. Torres is very worried about you. She's the one who told me to take up your memory. Simon went out into the yard and warned everyone that Alex would put him into hypnosis. We'll go to the market then. Now Matthew will help me. I will tell the neighbors that my nephew has arrived. Otherwise they are already looking askance at my house, as if I had stolen something. Mrs. Torres snorted. They left and Alex began her session. Simon closed his eyes, heard her voice and seemed to understand everything. She asked him questions, but he did not know the answers to them. Then he seemed to wake up. Her questions were as if in a fog. He couldn't remember what she asked or what he said. It was amazing. Happened? Simon asked. Alex was a little pale. It worked, but you didn't remember anything. You have only one memory of a girl with red lipstick in front of a mirror. Did I tell you about him? Simon asked in surprise. Yes, it's okay. Don't be scared. You don't have to remember. You know, even this session can help you remember your past. It will happen unexpectedly, spontaneously at some point. I'll just help you measure the locks and untie the knot. You will open the door yourself when you are ready. Their sessions continued. Simon began to visit them more often. Karen invariably led Matthew out of the house and winked frequently at Simon. She was clearly trying to set them up with Alex. She told him that she was a wonderful woman, but he was shy. But their hands touched more and more. They spent more and more time together, and their conversations became easier. The awkwardness is gone. They were already looking forward to this meeting. I really liked Matthew Simon, too. Alex did not tell anyone, but her son once confessed to her. Simon, of course, the homeless man, does not remember anything. He has nothing. But what he has is still more than Mark had. Yes, and my father too. He is a real man. He saved us and brought us back together. He took risks for us and asked for nothing in return. If you still want to find yourself a husband, look for someone like Simon the Real. She sighed and kissed her son on the top of his curly hair. He looked like his father, but he inherited his eyes from his mother. Alex knew that he liked one girl in the class, and Matthew was itching to get back to school with her. They were just starting a relationship. Alex had 3 more sessions, but in none of them did Simon remember anything new. However, he began to dream about his past and that girl with red lipstick, and some more snippets. The day of the pronouncement of the will has arrived. Alex was already calmly standing on her feet, helped by the decoctions of Mrs. Torres, with which she fed her. Everything will be fine. Honey, we will all be with you. Write a statement and immediately go to this killer. Such doctors should not save people. They should be in jail, Mrs. Torres said indignantly. Alex put on the clothes in which she was placed in the coffin. It was not her worst black trouser suit, which emphasized her beautiful figure. Matthew was ready too. Simon wore the same clothes, was clean, shaven, and the 3 of them got into the bus that took them to the city. There were a few more people inside. Outside the window was overcast, drizzling rain. Alex watched the drops run down the glass. She had wanted to go back to her old life for so long. She missed work, people, the city she grew up in. Simon sat next to her and they held hands. He was already holding her hand. For him, this trip meant only one thing. She would leave now, and they would not see him again, unless by chance. I wish you happiness, he said, looking into her bottomless eyes. Alex looked at Simon and instantly understood his thoughts. She did not think about it, but only about the fact that now she would wind up her former life. She gripped his hand tighter. You won't leave me. Will you come with me? She said hesitantly, as if asking a question. Simon shook his head. I can't come to you and live with you. It is not right. And why do you need me? Why would a woman like you care about someone like me? Don't think. I have no illusions. I'm really happy for you and will visit you if you want. Alex clung to his arm in a death grip. I don't want to be without you, she said softly to Simon, sighed and looked away. He decided everything for himself. Alex saw it in his eyes and removed her hand. He doesn't want to and doesn't need to. Don't really beg him. Now she had another task and she had no right to do something wrong. The 3 of them came to the station and Alex wrote a statement. Oh my God, she really is listed as deceased, the intern said as Alex told her story. Yes. And my son is missing. I'm sure Mark immediately filed a wanted list. My will be announced today. I compiled it for my son, but when she married Mark, she brought him in, too. He knows it. He hasn't disappeared from town yet with my money from the account just because he's waiting for a will. Today he will be announced, and in a few months he will enter into inheritance rights and will even be able to use Matthew's property as a guardian. It would have been better for him. It would have been better for him if my son had not gone missing. So he set out to look for him. With the property of a missing child, things are a little more complicated, I guess. The investigator sighed. Well, the story. But I hear you and they showed you on TV, he recalled. Alex smiled sheepishly. She wrote the application for more than an hour. When everything was ready, Alex, Matthew, Simon, accompanied by the police, went to their house. The lawyer's car was already there. Alex gave her big house a sad look. I missed you, she said, and Simon took her hand. Alex entered very confidently. At this point, the lawyer had already read the will. In attendance were Alex's cousins, Mark, and her best friend, Millie, whom the lawyer brought in personally because her name appeared in the wills. Seeing Alex, Mark's eyes widened. All present were in complete bewilderment, shock. "Mark Sigismund Willis, you are under arrest on charges of attempted murder." The policeman following Alex broke the silence. Mark was out of his mind with fear and horror of everything that was happening. "How did it happen that it happened? I've buried you." Alex stepped closer to Mark. She really wanted to hit him, but the police standing behind her were embarrassing. "It seems to be illegal, though." "Alex!" one of the policemen called out to her. The woman turned around. "You can do it once. Just don't break his jaw." The policeman understood her intentions, got into position, and gave the go-ahead. There was a sound in the room. Slaps. "I will pray that you die in prison. I will never forgive you for this, and you better not come out of there. If you ever get out, then run from this city, because I will be waiting for you." Matthew, he was angry. Alex only now realized how. Of course, he was now ready to break his stepfather. The police put Mark in handcuffs and took her out of the building. The rest were questioned. This all dragged on for several hours. As usual, Alex's best friend rejoiced most of all about the miraculous resurrection of Alex. Relatives are only curious, trying to gather information for gossip. Millie was with Alex to the last. Everything began to feel like a stranger when most of those present left the building an elderly lawyer. Alex got ready too. The lawyer approached Simon. "Thank you for saving my client. Alex, to me, to be honest, is not just a client. She is my friend and my psychiatrist. I work for her for free, and she doesn't charge me. So we have been helping each other for many years." Simon smiled sheepishly and held out his hand to the lawyer. He suddenly gazed into Simon's face. "Forgive me for being interested. It's just that you are very much like my friend. He went missing a few years ago, and his name was Edward." Alex stopped talking to her friend and flew to her lawyer. "You know him?" "He lost his memory and remembers nothing," she exclaimed. The lawyer put on his glasses and looked at Simon again. "I'm completely convinced." "Wow." Second opening of the evening. "It's like a dream. Edward, do you remember anything?" "You started working at my firm. Were the best student on the course. I personally asked that you be referred to me for practice. And before you disappeared, you settled in with me. We have successfully completed 2 cases in court. I was going to invite you to my anniversary. Alex, you remember I told you about a promising young lawyer who could take over my firm when I retire?" Alex nodded. "Did you say that you would introduce us?" "I had just met Mark then. You didn't like him right away, and you honestly told me about it." Yes, Alex, that's how it happened." But Simon doesn't remember anything. He remained completely bewildered. "You probably don't remember this, but my name is Abram Osterman. You disappeared after your second case. It was very loud. He opposed one well-known family. Mandos, they keep chickens with us, but a farm. Husband and wife shared property." Suddenly, a sharp headache pierced Simon, and the events began to burst into pieces in his memory. Alex sat him on the couch. She brought water. Now all attention was switched, but already on Simon. "Alex, I remember everything. It was you who helped. If not for your hypnosis, I would hardly have been able to remember." The lawyer and Millie, after making sure that Simon was all right, left. They had their own business, and it was already sunset outside. Simon and Alex were left alone. When it got completely dark, Matthew went to his beloved. She was terribly worried all this time while he was gone. "My name is Edward Wood. I grew up here in this city. I myself decided that I would protect innocent people. I myself received my red diploma. My parents died in an accident when I was only 14. Since then, I have been raised by my grandmother, Sonia's grandmother. I still remember how happy she was when I got married. She was able to attend our wedding, but after that she was gone. Then he graduated from the practice, and I began to work as a lawyer in a reputable firm. I worked there for many years until I realized that this was not at all what I wanted. Then I left and soon began working with Mr. Osterman in his law office. He knew me for a long time and received me with pleasure. My first client received a suspended sentence, exactly what we were hoping for. Given the evidence base, this was the best option for him. He was guilty, but not so much how much his ill-wishers wanted to accuse him. I won't bore myself with the details. It was an ordinary case. My second case, which was entrusted to me by Mr. Osterman, was more complicated. Husband and wife shared property. My husband, Mr. Herman Mandos, chose me as a defender. When I figured out the case, I realized that he is a disgusting person who is trying to leave his family without a livelihood. He was, in fact, a gigolo. He married in his youth the daughter of a rich man. He was helped to establish his business, and he was, in fact, nothing more than an employee. The girl's family gave him everything. Then the wife's parents died, and the husband began to cheat, squandering his fortunes, and during the divorce he wanted to take everything for himself. I myself then went to his wife and offered her help. In the end, I became her lawyer, not his. By refusing to defend Herman, I crossed his path. He began to threaten me right away, and this continued for several months while litigation lasted. When I won the trial, Mr. Osterman was proud of me. He said that this case would open up new horizons for me. Basically, I left Herman without pants. He received only a small share of the fortune, exactly as much as he earned, and he did not manage to take advantage of any loophole in the marriage contract. I foresaw everything, acting a few steps ahead. But I was young and did not take into account the fact that Herman spent several years in a maximum security prison. Of course, he decided to take revenge on me. I was returning home this evening when a truck crashed into me at full speed. I saw it and saw that Herman was personally driving. I jumped out of the car at full speed and hit my head. Miraculously survived. The homeless picked me up and left. Well, then you know everything. I did the right thing in my conscience and I have nothing to regret. And I did not quarrel with Herman. I came to him and honestly said that I went to work as a lawyer to protect people, defend honor and dignity, and work on the side of justice. I wasn't interested in money. It was important for me that the issues were resolved according to conscience. As a student, I heard this phrase, "They will kill you, Edward, for your integrity." And so it happened. But it turned out to be more difficult to kill me than one could imagine. "I'm glad you're alive." Alex took his hand. They sat very close and looked into each other's eyes. Evil has just been defeated. Mark went to jail. Alex could have gone upstairs for a bath, but she was here with him. She didn't want to leave him. "And I'm glad you're alive, Alex." Smiling at him, Alex reached out for a kiss. Edward couldn't help himself, and the kiss took place. Timid, not brave, but so desirable. However, after that, Alex saw in Edward's eyes a completely different expression than what she would like to see. There was sadness in his eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked. He smiled. From a psychiatrist, it is difficult to conceal anything. Alex nodded and ran her hand over his face. "I'm married. I'm still Alex's wife, that girl with the red lipstick. She is my wife, Emily. For some reason, it seemed to me that she was my sister or just acquaintances. The subconscious mind doesn't lie." "Maybe you don't love her?" Alex asked hopefully. It had just seemed that, as an exception, she had come across a normal man, a good man. Why does he have to be married in the end? It's just the law of meanness. Alex shook her head. But, of course, such a man could not be a bachelor. I just couldn't. I didn't love her. We were supposed to get a divorce, but did not have time. I caught her after another, and we decided to disperse peacefully. We have a daughter, and she is about the same age as Matthew, bigger than my daughter. Let's go to them now. Do you remember the address? I remember, but now it's probably too late. Can you wait longer? Edward shook his head. He was terribly curious about how his wife and daughter lived. Alex started the car, and they drove to another part of the city. Half an hour later, Edward was standing in front of his own door. I have a feeling that it was not in this life, but in the past. Everything is familiar but strange, he said. I'll wait for you downstairs. You know, if you decide to stay, I'll wait an hour. I think this is enough time for you to decide. Edward took her hand. But Alex shook her head. This is your family, Edward. I understand if you want to be with them. He clenched his jaw and pulled Alex by the arm towards him. He took her into his arms. Several years have passed. I don't know what awaits me there, but I know exactly how I feel. Now we will talk about this. I will come to you. Alex nodded and left to wait for his car. Edward plucked up courage and rang the doorbell of his own house. Alex was nervous. It's been 30 minutes already. She imagined a picture of a happy family reunion, and those fantasies brought her pain. Another 10 minutes passed. The front door swung open, and Edward stepped out. He got into the car and smiled at her. I said I'd come. Sorry for making you wait. Will you tell? She asked timidly as she started the engine. It was cold in the car. It has been dark outside for a long time. A stranger opened the door for me. Emily divorced me when I was reported missing. My daughter is the only one who made me happy. In fact, I was with her the whole time. She asked me to stay, but Emily hinted to me in no uncertain terms that she would not leave me to spend the night. So tomorrow I'm meeting my daughter in the park at 10:00. Alex smiled. Then let's go to me. Matthew is already asleep. He called while you were gone. His little girl couldn't calm down. I cried when he arrived, so he brought her home, and they are already sleeping. Now she sometimes spends the night with us. Sometimes he stays with her. They are almost adults now. Edward nodded. They arrived, took a shower. Alex made a bed in the living room when she turned off the light in the house. Edward did not let her go alone. The next day, Edward came to his daughter, and she told him how she and her mother were looking for him. Emily was really worried. She filed a wanted list, posted an announcement about the loss of Edward on the web. Amanda, Edward's daughter, said that Edward himself was not so much important to Mom as it was important to get a divorce. She could do this only after he was recognized as missing. Then she married her lover and brought him to Edward's house. The girl did not find a common language with her stepfather. She doted on her father and declared that she wanted to live with him. This was after Edward had left the previous evening. Emily was furious. I tore and threw. Emily agrees to let Amanda go. And where would you let her go now? Edward just got back. He had nothing but the memories that came back to him. Do not take a child to a hut near a cemetery. Edward returned to Alex after meeting Amanda. I have to go. I have to go to Mrs. Torres. I'll tell you everything. I'll call Mr. Osterman. He promised to help at first. Alex frowned. You've always been so stubborn. There is a house. I have a huge house. Enough space for you and Amanda. Why are you hiding? Edward shook his head. I can't sit on your neck like that. Edward left, and Alex didn't see him for a month. She didn't know where to call to see him. Didn't know anything about him. Where did he go? Maybe he went back to that house by the cemetery. It was a beautiful summer evening when the doorbell rang. Matthew went to open it. He had just recently broken up with his girlfriend and sat at home all day, depressed. She left him, she herself said, that she fell in love with another. Mom, is this for you? He shouted and invited Edward to enter. Alex barely recognized him when he entered. He had a neat haircut, clean shaven and cheeks in a belly suit, not from the shoulder of Mrs. Torres' late husband, and in his hands was a bouquet of flowers. Sorry, Lost. I couldn't help it. After all, I'm a man. Mr. Osterman took me in, and I asked him not to tell you anything, so you could accept help from him, but I didn't. Alex was indignant. She was terribly nervous all this time. Yes, I was able to accept help from my mentor, from a man. He is a widower and lives alone. I started working and have already earned something. I rented an apartment, and now I can invite you on a real date." Alex shook her head. "And if I were your wife and you, for example, broke your leg and could not work, you would leave me?" "What kind of nonsense?" "No, I wouldn't leave you. And I like the way you think. Because marrying you is definitely in my plans," Edward said. Alex smiled at him. They went to a cafe where Edward told her how he butted heads with his ex-wife for a month. He left her everything that she had issued for herself, considering him dead, but Amanda herself wanted to live with her father. Her stepfather abused her. I didn't beat, of course, but conflicts constantly broke out between them. Edward tried to resolve everything peacefully. However, Emily struck a pose. Then Mr. Osterman came to talk to her. "Emily, you will lose the car and the dacha. After all this belonged to Edward long before he married you. Besides, you'll still lose your daughter. First, because of their own stubbornness. After all, Amanda herself wants to live with her father. Secondly, to lose her by a court decision, since the girl is already an adult. And the court will take into account her testimony, and she will not be silent and will tell about everything. For example, about that slap in the face. What did you say when she said she wanted to go with Dad? Think, Emily. After all, Amanda is growing up so and so soon that she herself will decide where and with whom she will live. Do not enmity and yield with it. I have 3 daughters myself. I know how hard it is for them. My wife died when the youngest was only 10, and I raised them myself. Edward is like a son to me. You know, his inner qualities are close to me. He is a wonderful person. You are not a stranger to me either. I will take care of his business. And if you don't agree to let Amanda go to her father, after all, she hasn't seen him in years. The jury will weep when he tells them his story. Emily, it was straight up code. Should I let my daughter go to his new grandmother or to you? He doesn't even have a roof over his head. If you continue to exercise, he will take his roof back. This question will disappear by itself. But answering your question, now he lives with me, then he will rent an apartment. He and Alex might get along, but you have nothing to worry about. She will not replace Amanda's mother. That doesn't happen. And they will find a common language. After all, Alex is a certified psychologist, peached, and her son is at the same age as Amanda is now. It was you who wanted a divorce and married someone else. So you should accept the fact that now you have different families. Emily sighed. Mr. Osterman won this case before the trial. This is what he considered the highest victory. That evening, Amanda packed up and moved in with her father. Edward and Alex talked for a long time. Toward evening, they decided to go to Mrs. Torres with a cake. They took Matthew and Amanda with them. Matthew was having a hard time breaking up with his ex-girlfriend, but Amanda seemed to revive him. Edward proposed to Alex. The children approved of their parents' choice. Alex and Amanda quickly hit it off. Every weekend they came to Mrs. Torres, and so every time they asked when they would get together. Adults have nothing to be ashamed of. You need to get married. Alex and Edward were always embarrassed. Last time they announced their engagement, Mrs. Torres was as happy for them as her son and daughter. Alex invited her to move in with them, but Karen refused. I love my house. And how do I leave mine? I visit them almost every day. Edward nodded. He knew how dear she was. The memory of his daughter to him. The wedding was scheduled for the fall. Now that the awkwardness was gone, Alex and Edward enjoyed each other's company and couldn't stop talking. In the evenings, they chose a movie in turn and watched it, not letting go of each other's arms. Amanda and Matthew were happy for their parents. Amanda did not visit her mother for a long time, but their relationship nevertheless improved. Mark was condemned by the efforts of Mr. Osterman. He received 8 years in prison. The wedding was loud. There were all friends and relatives, and there was, and Mrs. Torres, and Mr. Osterman. 2 years later, Alex gave birth to Edward and a girl. They named her Margot. And 2 years later, their children Amanda and Matthew got married. After a while, they had twin boys Demise and Detu. Mrs. Torres was a frequent visitor to them. She became like family to them. And in the summer, Alex and Edward would definitely visit her for a couple of weeks.